In a land where anti-American sentiment was rampant, one man suffered the brunt of the hatred and led negotiations with the revolutionary powerhouse, shaping relations that would last far into the future. Jimmy Carter and the Iranian hostage crisis. Iran had drawn great interest from the West due to its discovery of oil in 1908. Until 1953, the United States stayed out of Iranian politics and advocated for an independent Iran under the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. However, as the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh began to move Iran in a direction closer to communism and Moscow, the CIA feared the loss of democracy in the region and overthrew Mossadegh and reconsolidated power under the Shah. With military equipment and financial support from the United States, the Shah was able to lead Iran into a period of prosperity. During this period, resentment among the Iranian civilians grew due to the uneven distribution of wealth and increasing Western influence from the United States. This led to an uprising by the Islamic clergy and was put down by the Shah, who sent the clergy's leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, into exile for 15 years. As opposition to the Shah grew more and more apparent, the Shah used a secret police force, or SAVAK, to crack down on dissenters, further fueling anger. Finally, in 1979, the Shah fled to Egypt amid intensifying unrest, and Khomeini returned to be placed as the leader of the revolution. Later, when the Shah was suffering from cancer and asked for entry into the US to be treated, President Carter was reluctant at first to grant him entry due to the possible repercussions, but eventually let the Shah in, citing humanitarian reasons. This decision ultimately led to the seizing of the United States Embassy in Tehran on November 4, 1979, by a mob of Iranian students. The overrunning of the US Embassy epitomized the anti-American sentiment among the Iranian people. Initially, 66 Americans were taken hostage, but Khomeini released all of the females, non-Americans, and African Americans, stating that those types of people already suffered the oppression of American society. After the release of some of the hostages, 52 hostages remained, and the Iranian students claimed that they would not release the hostages until the Shah was returned to Iran so he could be put on trial. In response, President Carter immediately attempted to build pressure on Iran by applying economic pressure and by freezing Iranian assets while trying to find a diplomatic resolution. After months of failed negotiations, Carter cut off diplomatic ties with Iran and made retrieving the hostages his primary goal for the rest of his presidency. Despite pressure from the American public to use military action to rescue the hostages, Carter displayed a strong sense of compassion in his hesitance to use military action. His strong display of compassion can be derived from his pledge to promote basic human rights, alleviate suffering, and encourage peace in the Middle East. Nonetheless, as more and more pressure from the American public and media built up, President Carter ultimately attempted a top-secret military operation to extract the hostages. This mission was known as Operation Eagle Claw, which was a complete failure due to the malfunctioning of 3 of the helicopters while flying over an Iranian desert, resulting in the death of 8 servicemen. This attempt was made a laughingstock on Iranian broadcasts and was a stark symbol of American impotence. At this point in the crisis, Carter's popularity plunged to 20% with the election of 1980 looming. America's discontent with and disbelief in Carter were apparent in the election, as Ronald Reagan won in a landslide. Despite knowing that America had less confidence in him, Jimmy Carter was able to persevere, remain calm, focused, and poised in a time of intensifying pressure and stress. Carter worked tirelessly day and night for the last couple of weeks of his term to secure the release of the hostages by the end of his presidency.
He demonstrated a lot of patience, and I think at the end of the day, that patience paid off.
After months of negotiating, Carter agreed to unfreeze several $billion in Iranian gold and bank assets. As there was not much left for the Khomeini regime to gain, especially since the Shah had passed away in July of 1980, Khomeini decided to release the hostages on January 20, 1981. Although Carter's wish to have secured the hostages by the end of his term was not fulfilled, the hostages, who were held captive for 444 days, were released just minutes after Reagan's inauguration. Carter's tireless persistence, determination, and ability to remain level-headed in an extremely stressful situation showcased his ability to lead, despite the lack of support from the American public and media. Nonetheless, Carter's actions only further distinguished the rift between the United States and Iran. Carter's actions not only had important repercussions at the time of the crisis in 1979, but also have been impactful in current-day relations with Iran. After losing the 1980 presidential election to Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter began to focus on spreading his strong humanitarian beliefs to the rest of the world. This resembles his primary reason for allowing the Shah, who was battling cancer, into the US for treatment. Carter embarked on journeys to third world countries and essentially acted as an ambassador to make sure the governments in those countries were stable and were making the best decisions for their countries. Although Carter received a significant amount of hate during his presidency for his actions during the hostage crisis, he has been more appreciated after his presidency for all of his humanitarian and diplomatic deeds across the world. Similarly, the hostage crisis has also had far-reaching effects both within and out of the United States. The hostage crisis epitomizes an event that depicts so clearly how self-defeating emotion can grotesquely misshape global politics. One of the primary lessons from the hostage crisis is that an entire nation could be aroused by powerful images. In this case, the humiliating hostage predicament, which captivated a nation for 14 months, aroused American emotions so intensely that to this day, the emotions towards Iran have not calmed down. On the other side, the crisis ignited patriotic sentiment in Iran that allowed the Islamic government to consolidate its power. Shortly after the hostage crisis, Iraq attacked Iran, hoping to take advantage of the revolutionary chaos in Iran to increase its territory. This led to the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. The United States played an important role in this war because the US drove weapons and supplies into the arms of Saddam Hussein, and Iraq because the United States was still angry at Iran. This allowed Iraq to win the war and ultimately gave Saddam Hussein, who was later put on the FBI's most wanted list, complete power over Iraq. During the Khatami presidency in Iran from 1997 to 2005, Mohammad Khatami attempted to create a dialogue with the American people, but the prospect of relieving tensions was met with strong opposition. In his State of the Union address in 2002, President George Bush denounced Iran as a part of an axis of evil with Iraq and North Korea. This shows that the tensions from the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979 are still high and that they have lasting implications in terms of how each country views the other. Towards the end of 2002, the US government accused Iran of a clandestine nuclear weapons program. This was met with a stark counter from Iran denying the nuclear weapons program. As a result of the hostage crisis, relations between the United States and Iran and the Middle East continue to suffer.
In terms of Iran, the hostage crisis remains an open sore that hasn't healed.
And the tensions from the hostage crisis are still evident in modern-day society in the sense of how each country is viewed by the other.
If there's anyone out there that doesn't like us, it must be because they're evil. This was the view that was given both in Iran and in the United States.
Despite numerous failed attempts of negotiating and finding a diplomatic solution to the crisis, Jimmy Carter exhibited great compassion and perseverance when it came to rescuing the hostages. He also carried on these important leadership qualities throughout his life after presidency in his endeavors to bestow humanitarian principles upon the rest of the world. Therefore, Jimmy Carter's leadership in a time of crisis was very methodical, and the results of the crisis have had far-reaching impacts on society today.
The last thing I said, as I was pushed and shoved and yelled at boarding an aircraft provided by the government of Algeria to get out of Tehran and regain my freedom, I said to the senior hostage taker at the top of the ramp before I entered that aircraft, I look forward to the day when your country and mine can again have a normal diplomatic relationship. I said that then, at midnight on a dark and difficult night, and I've said it ever since.